Sup you beautiful people, hope you've had a fantastic day. Welcome back to another new episode of What If Naruto Abandoned Konoha after the Sasuke Retrieval Arc. What if Naruto, the hero we know, left Konoha after his devastating failure to retrieve Sasuke? Imagine the hidden leaf without its brightest beacon, forcing new heroes and villains to rise. This isn't just a fan theory. It's a deep dive into an alternate reality where Naruto's choices reshape the entire ninja world. If you guys enjoy this what if, comment down below and let me know. And go ahead and check out other what ifs in the channel after watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like, and also share this video with your friends. So now let's start this video. 3 weeks after the emergency council meeting, Konoha felt like a different village entirely. The changes were subtle at first: increased patrols, additional security checkpoints, new protocols for monitoring civilian activities that might indicate foreign infiltration, standard responses to elevated threat levels, the kind of adjustments that any competent military organization would implement when facing potential external pressure. But beneath the surface, something more fundamental was shifting in the way the village understood itself and its place in the world. The Ninetales container's defection represents more than just a personnel loss. Danzo explained to the expanded Security Council he'd convened in a secure facility beneath the village's administrative district. It demonstrates the fundamental inadequacy of our current approach to managing strategic assets and potential threats. The dozen men and women seated around the table represented Konoha's security apparatus, department heads, senior commanders, intelligence coordinators who'd spent their careers protecting the village from external enemies. Now they found themselves grappling with the possibility that their greatest threat might come from within. Our psychological assessments indicate widespread morale degradation among the younger generation, reported Yamanaka Inoichi, his mental analysis techniques having been deployed extensively over the past weeks. The Uzumaki boy represented hope and determination to many of them. His absence has created a vacuum that's being filled by doubt and cynicism, which makes them vulnerable to external manipulation, added Morino Ibiki, his interrogation experience giving him unique insights into psychological weaknesses. Enemy agents could exploit their disillusionment to recruit assets or plant disinformation. Danzo nodded slowly, processing these assessments against his larger strategic vision for the village's future. The Naruto crisis had created exactly the kind of environment where more aggressive security measures would be not just accepted, but demanded by a population that was beginning to understand how vulnerable they really were. Recommendations, he asked. Enhanced screening protocols for all academy graduates, Inoichi suggested. Psychological evaluation to identify potential loyalty risks before they're given access to sensitive information or missions. Expanded surveillance of civilian populations, particularly those with histories of discontent or anti-village sentiment, Ibiki added. If we're going to prevent future defections, we need to identify problems before they metastasize. And preemptive action against individuals assessed as potential security risks, concluded a root operative whose presence at the meeting would have surprised many senior village officials. Detention, re-education, or elimination depending on threat level and remediation potential. The suggestions were exactly what Danzo had hoped to hear: practical security measures that would expand his organization's authority while appearing to address legitimate concerns about village stability. The Naruto situation had provided perfect justification for implementing policies he'd been advocating for years. "I'll draft proposals for the Hokage's consideration," he said, with satisfaction barely concealed beneath professional concern. The current crisis requires decisive action to prevent future disasters of similar magnitude. In the academy training grounds, the impact of Naruto's absence was immediately visible to anyone who understood what to look for. Rock Lee stood before a group of second-year students, leading them through basic taijutsu forms with his usual enthusiasm. But even his legendary optimism couldn't completely mask the changes that had affected the entire training program. "Remember," he called out as the students practiced their stances, "dedication and hard work can overcome any obstacle. The flames of youth burn brightest when facing adversity." But the words felt hollow in ways they never had before. Because everyone present, instructors and students alike, was aware that dedication and hard work hadn't been enough to keep their most famous graduate from abandoning everything the village represented. "Sensei," one of the students asked during a break, "is it true that Naruto-san left the village because he was angry about failing his mission?" Lee paused, considering how to answer a question that cut to the heart of what everyone was thinking, but few were willing to voice directly. Naruto-san made choices based on circumstances that were complicated, he said finally, but that doesn't change the fact that dedication to your teammates and your village is the foundation of everything we do here. But what if your village doesn't want you? Another student pressed. What if you try your hardest and it's never enough? The question hung in the air like an accusation, because it touched on fears that many of the students harbored about their own futures. If someone as powerful and accomplished as Naruto could be rejected by the village he'd sworn to protect, what hope did any of them have for genuine acceptance? Then you try harder, Lee replied with forced conviction. You prove through your actions that you deserve the trust and respect you seek. Like Naruto did, the first student asked with the kind of brutal innocence that children specialized in. He saved the village lots of times, but people still treated him like a monster. How much harder was he supposed to try? Lee opened his mouth to provide the traditional answer about perseverance and eventual recognition, but the words died in his throat. Because the honest answer was that Naruto had tried hard enough to deserve everything the village should have offered him, and it hadn't been sufficient to overcome their fundamental prejudice against what he represented. The circumstances were unique, he said weakly, falling back on the official explanation that satisfied no one. We can't let one person's choices determine our own commitment to the village that protects us. But even as he spoke, Lee could see the doubt in his students' eyes, the way they looked at him with expressions that suggested they were beginning to question whether the village was worth the kind of absolute loyalty it demanded from its ninja. It was a dangerous development, and one that would have significant implications for the next generation's willingness to sacrifice themselves for people who might never appreciate what they gave up. The external pressures were becoming more obvious with each passing week. Intelligence reports indicate increased border activity from all neighboring territories, Shikaku Nara briefed Tsunade during their daily security update. Not direct aggression, but probing actions designed to test our response capabilities and assess our current defensive posture. They know, Tsunade said grimly, studying maps that showed the pattern of incursions and provocations. Somehow, word has gotten out about Naruto's absence, and they're evaluating whether we're vulnerable enough to justify more aggressive action. It was inevitable, Shikaku replied with characteristic pragmatism. The Nine-Tails Jinchuriki's presence was a known strategic factor for every major power in the region. His disappearance creates opportunities that our enemies would be foolish not to explore. What kind of opportunities? Territory disputes we've kept frozen through threat of overwhelming retaliation. Resource conflicts we've prevented through demonstration of superior force. Political challenges we've suppressed through the implied promise of devastating consequences for aggression. Tsunade closed her eyes, feeling the weight of strategic reality settling on her shoulders. Naruto hadn't just been their most powerful weapon, he'd been the foundation of their entire regional security posture. His mere existence had prevented conflicts that were now beginning to resurface as their enemies recalculated the cost-benefit analysis of challenging Konoha directly. Recommendations: show of force deployments to key border regions, accelerated training programs for our remaining Jinchuriki assets, and Shikaku hesitated before continuing. Consideration of alternative deterrent strategies that don't rely on assets we can no longer guarantee will remain under village control, such as preemptive strikes against enemies who are positioning for potential aggression. Alliance negotiations that trade territorial concessions for security guarantees, and enhanced internal security measures to prevent future defections that could compromise our strategic position. Each suggestion represented a fundamental shift away from the approach that had defined Konoha's strategy for decades. Instead of projecting strength from a position of confidence, they were being forced to consider options that prioritized short-term stability over long-term security. Draft contingency plans for all three approaches, Tsunade ordered, and start quiet negotiations with our intelligence assets in other villages. I want to know exactly how much they know about our current situation and what they're planning to do about it. The psychological impact on Konoha's remaining young ninja was perhaps the most troubling development of all. Sakura Haruno stood in the hospital's surgical wing, her hands moving with mechanical precision as she sutured a wound that would heal cleanly and leave minimal scarring. Her medical skills had advanced dramatically over the past months, driven by a need to prove her worth that had become almost obsessive in its intensity. Excellent work, Tsunade observed from behind her. Your surgical technique has improved remarkably in a very short time. Thank you, Tsunade-sama, Sakura replied without looking up from her work. I've been practicing extensively. 18 hours a day, according to your schedule. That's not practice, Sakura, that's escape. The assessment was accurate, and they both knew it. Sakura had thrown herself into medical training with the kind of desperate intensity that people used to avoid thinking about things too painful to examine directly. I'm committed to becoming the best medical ninja I can be, she said, with the kind of formal precision that avoided any emotional content. You're committed to avoiding any situation where you might have to think about your former teammates, Tsunade corrected gently. Which is understandable, but ultimately counterproductive to your development as both a ninja and a person. Sakura's hands stilled for a moment, her carefully maintained composure wavering slightly before she resumed her work with renewed focus. My former teammates made their choices. I'm making mine, and your choice is to isolate yourself from any connection that might involve emotional risk. My choice is to focus on skills that help people rather than weapons that hurt them. The implicit criticism of her former team's combat focus was obvious, and Tsunade found herself wondering how many other young ninja were developing similar perspectives on the value of power versus service. Healing is important, Tsunade said carefully, but so is the strength to protect what you're trying to heal. The two aren't mutually exclusive, they're complementary aspects of what it means to serve your village. Strength, Sakura repeated with barely concealed bitterness. Like Sasuke's strength when he decided revenge was more important than bonds. Like Naruto's strength when he decided the village wasn't worth protecting. Their strength wasn't the problem, Sakura. The problem was that they used their strength to serve goals that didn't include the people who cared about them. Maybe the people who cared about them should have done a better job of showing it, Sakura replied, and the words carried enough pain and accusation to make Tsunade wince. Because the horrible truth was that Sakura was right. The village had failed both Sasuke and Naruto in different but equally devastating ways, and those failures were now rippling outward to affect an entire generation of young ninja who were losing faith in the institutions they'd been taught to serve. What do you think we should have done differently? Tsunade asked. Sakura was quiet for a long time, finishing her surgical work before finally answering. I think you should have seen them as people instead of weapons. I think you should have cared about their happiness instead of just their utility. And I think you should have realized that bonds require maintenance, not just expectation. Each word was precisely chosen to inflict maximum impact, delivered with the clinical precision that Sakura had learned to apply to everything in her life. And now it's too late for them, but maybe not too late for the rest of us. Maybe the next generation of ninja can learn from your mistakes instead of repeating them. As Sakura left to continue her rounds, Tsunade remained in the surgical suite, contemplating the implications of what she'd heard. The village's future defenders were developing a fundamentally different understanding of loyalty, service, and the relationship between individual happiness and institutional obligation. It might make them better people, but it would certainly make them more difficult to control when control became necessary for village survival. That evening, as reports filtered in from across the village about decreased morale, increased security concerns, and growing questions about leadership competence, Danzo met with a select group of root operatives in a facility that didn't officially exist. The Hokage's approach to crisis management continues to prove inadequate, he observed, reviewing intelligence assessments that painted a disturbing picture of systemic vulnerability. Emotional attachments to failed policies prevent the decisive action necessary to protect village interests. What do you recommend? Asked one of his subordinates. Acceleration of our contingency planning. If current leadership cannot adapt to changed circumstances, alternative leadership must be prepared to assume responsibility for village security. A coup, a transition, Danzo corrected with the kind of euphemistic precision that made radical changes sound like administrative adjustments. When the current administration's failures become undeniable, the village council will require new options for ensuring stability and security. Around the table, masked faces nodded in understanding. They'd been preparing for this opportunity for years, developing networks and resources that could assume control when traditional authority structures proved inadequate. The Naruto crisis had created exactly the kind of systemic failure that justified extraordinary measures to preserve what could be saved of Konoha's power and purpose. Timeline? Someone asked. Dependent on external factors. If the Uzumaki situation escalates to direct threat status, if our enemies capitalize on perceived weakness, if internal unrest reaches levels that compromise operational security, Danzo shrugged. Any of those developments could trigger immediate implementation of our transition plans. As the meeting concluded and his operatives dispersed to carry out their assignments, Danzo remained in the secure facility contemplating the strategic advantages represented by crisis and opportunity. The boy who'd once dreamed of becoming Hokage had inadvertently created exactly the conditions necessary for real leadership to emerge in Konoha. Leadership that understood the practical requirements of power, that prioritized results over sentiment, that valued village security more than individual feelings. Soon, very soon, the village would understand that strength came from unity of purpose rather than tolerance of dissent, from decisive action rather than emotional hesitation. The darkness rising in Konoha wasn't a failure of their ideals. It was the natural evolution of those ideals when confronted with reality's harsh demands. And Danzo intended to guide that evolution toward its logical and necessary conclusion, regardless of what sentimental obstacles stood in the way. The mission briefing room felt smaller than usual, though that might have been due to the weight of expectations pressing down on everyone present. Tsunade stood before a carefully selected group of Konoha's most promising young ninja, studying faces that carried a mixture of determination and barely concealed uncertainty. "The situation is straightforward," she began, though everyone in the room knew that nothing about their current circumstances was remotely straightforward. Increased external pressure on our borders, testing of our defensive capabilities, and the need to demonstrate that Konoha remains a formidable military power regardless of recent personnel changes. Rock Lee sat straighter in his chair, his eyes blazing with the kind of enthusiasm that had always defined his approach to impossible challenges. Beside him, Neji maintained his usual composed expression, though close observation would have revealed the tension in his shoulders that spoke of someone preparing to bear weight he wasn't certain he could carry. "The mission parameters are similar to operations previously handled by our Ninetales asset," Tsunade continued, using clinical terminology that couldn't quite disguise the personal implications of what she was discussing. "High-priority target elimination in hostile territory, with secondary objectives that require both significant combat capability and tactical flexibility." "You want us to replace Naruto," Tenten said quietly, voicing what everyone was thinking but no one had wanted to say directly. "I want you to demonstrate that Konoha's strength isn't dependent on any single individual," Tsunade corrected, though the distinction felt academic to everyone present. "That our village produces exceptional ninja capable of handling whatever challenges we face." The problem, as everyone in the room understood, was that replacing Naruto wasn't simply a matter of finding ninja with comparable combat skills. His unique combination of raw power, tactical unpredictability, and psychological impact on both allies and enemies had made him irreplaceable in ways that went far beyond conventional military assessment. "What's the target?" Neji asked, his analytical mind already working through the strategic requirements and resource allocation necessary for success. "Rogue missing nin from Hidden Rock, S-Class designation, confirmed to be organizing resistance movements in 3 separate territories." Tsunade activated a projection that displayed intelligence assessments and geographical data. "Standard elimination protocol would require a full Anbu team with extended mission timeline. We're assigning it to your squad with expectation of completion within 1 week." The timeline was aggressive to the point of being unrealistic, and they all knew it. Under normal circumstances, such a mission would indeed require specialized Anbu teams with months of preparation and intelligence gathering. The compressed schedule was clearly designed to test whether they could achieve results comparable to what Naruto had been capable of during his most effective operational periods. "Squad composition?" Lee asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "You 3 plus Kiba and Shino for tracking and reconnaissance support. 5-man team, maximum flexibility, full authorization for whatever tactical approaches you deem necessary. No mention of non-lethal alternatives or civilian casualty minimization, the kind of restrictions that had been standard for missions involving younger ninja. They were being given the same operational freedom that had been reserved for the village's most elite assets. It was both an opportunity and a burden that none of them felt entirely prepared to shoulder. "When do we leave?" Neji asked. "Tomorrow at dawn. Intelligence suggests the target will be moving to a new location within the next few days, so timing is critical for successful interception." As the briefing concluded and the team began discussing tactical approaches, Tsunade remained behind to observe their planning process. She was looking for signs that they understood the true nature of what they were being asked to do, not just complete a mission, but proved that Konoha could function without the weapon they'd lost. The early discussions were encouraging. Lee's enthusiasm was infectious, driving the team toward aggressive approaches that prioritized speed and decisive action. Neji's analytical capabilities helped refine those approaches into workable tactical plans. The combination suggested they might indeed be capable of achieving results comparable to what Naruto had provided. But as the planning continued, subtle problems began to emerge. The target's known capabilities include Earth-style jutsu that could neutralize our speed advantages, Neji observed, studying the intelligence reports. If we can't maintain mobility superiority, the mission timeline becomes much more challenging. We adapt and overcome, Lee declared with characteristic optimism. The flames of youth burn brightest when facing adversity. Enthusiasm doesn't counter advanced Earth techniques, Tenten replied pragmatically. We need strategic solutions, not motivational speeches. The exchange highlighted exactly the problem Tsunade had been afraid they'd encounter. Lee's determination and Neji's intelligence were formidable assets, but they lacked the raw, overwhelming power that had made Naruto's approach to similar challenges so effective. Naruto would have simply powered through defensive Earth techniques with Nine-Tails' enhanced strength, or used mass shadow clones to overwhelm tactical disadvantages through sheer numerical superiority. These ninja, for all their considerable skills, were constrained by normal human limitations that required far more complex solutions to the same problems. We'll work around the limitations, Neji said finally. Detailed reconnaissance, multiple contingency plans, careful coordination of our individual specialties. It was a sensible approach, the kind of professional mission planning that characterized Konoha's best teams. But it was also exactly the kind of methodical, resource-intensive operation that Naruto's unique capabilities had allowed them to avoid. One ninja with overwhelming individual power could accomplish in days what even their best teams might require weeks to achieve safely. 3 days later, the mission's first reports arrived at Tsunade's desk, and her worst fears were confirmed. Initial contact achieved, target located and assessed, she read from Neji's field report. Enemy capabilities exceed intelligence estimates, requesting backup and extended timeline for completion. The request was professionally written and tactically justified, but it represented exactly the kind of outcome they'd been hoping to avoid. Instead of demonstrating Konoha's continued strength, the mission was highlighting their new limitations. Additional intelligence suggests target has recruited local support, increasing operational complexity, the report continued. Current team composition may be inadequate for successful completion within original parameters. Tsunade set down the report and rubbed her temples, feeling the familiar pressure of problems that had no good solutions. Sending backup would compromise the demonstration of strength they'd hoped to achieve. Extending the timeline would suggest weakness to any foreign observers monitoring their operations. But allowing the mission to fail would be even worse for village morale and external perceptions. Hokage-sama, her assistant, appeared in the doorway. There's been a development. The team is requesting immediate extraction. The words hit her like a physical blow. Not mission completion, not even mission extension. Extraction, the admission of failure that would undo weeks of careful diplomatic and psychological management. What happened? Ambush by superior forces, multiple team members injured, target escaped to fortified position that would require siege tactics to assault successfully. The assistant's voice carried the kind of careful neutrality that bad news demanded. Casualties are manageable, but mission objectives are no longer achievable with available resources. Tsunade closed her eyes, feeling the weight of strategic reality crushing down on her shoulders. The mission that was supposed to prove Konoha's continued strength had instead demonstrated their new vulnerabilities in the most public way possible. Authorize extraction, she said quietly. Full medical support, immediate debriefing, and prepare cover stories that minimize the political implications. After her assistant left, Tsunade remained alone in her office contemplating the magnitude of what this failure represented. It wasn't just a failed mission. It was proof that replacing Naruto's unique capabilities was far more complicated than simply assigning comparable missions to other skilled ninja. The village had become dependent on having a weapon so powerful that traditional tactical considerations were irrelevant. Without that weapon, they were forced to acknowledge limitations they'd grown comfortable ignoring. The teams returned 2 days later, confirmed what the reports had already made clear. Lee sat in the hospital bed with his left arm in a sling and bandages covering burns from Earth-style techniques that had proven more advanced than their intelligence had suggested. His usual enthusiasm was notably absent, replaced by the kind of subdued introspection that came from confronting personal limitations in ways that had real consequences. The target was stronger than we expected, he admitted when Tsunade visited for debriefing, but that's not why we failed. Then why did you fail? Because we spent so much energy trying to be what we're not that we forgot to be what we are, Lee said quietly. We tried to accomplish the mission the way Naruto would have, instead of finding our own approach to the problem. The insight was more sophisticated than Tsunade had expected from Lei, and it highlighted exactly the psychological challenge they were facing. The village's remaining ninja were measuring themselves against Naruto's capabilities rather than developing approaches that suited their own strengths. And what approach would have worked better? Longer timeline, more comprehensive intelligence gathering, coordinated assault using our individual specialties instead of trying to replicate overwhelming individual power. Lee's analysis was tactically sound, even if it represented the kind of methodical approach that Naruto's presence had allowed them to avoid. We're good ninja, Tsunade-sama, but we're not the same kind of ninja. Across the room, Neji was receiving similar treatment for injuries sustained during their failed extraction. His Byakugan had been crucial for getting the team out alive, but even his enhanced perception hadn't been enough to compensate for the tactical disadvantages they'd faced. The mission parameters were unrealistic, he reported with characteristic directness. Designed around capabilities we don't possess rather than strategic objectives we could actually achieve. Meaning that trying to replace Naruto's individual combat effectiveness is probably impossible. But that doesn't mean we can't accomplish the same strategic goals through different methods. It was the same conclusion Lee had reached, and one that suggested the village's approach to managing Naruto's absence needed fundamental reconsideration. What do you recommend? Stop trying to find a replacement. Start developing new tactical approaches that utilize our available assets effectively instead of trying to compensate for assets we no longer have. The recommendation made sense, but it also represented an admission that Konoha would need to fundamentally change how it operated in the world. Instead of projecting power through overwhelming individual capability, they would need to rely on more traditional approaches to military strength. It was a more realistic strategy, but also one that would require time, resources, and political adjustments they might not be able to afford while their enemies were actively testing their perceived weaknesses. The psychological impact of the mission's failure rippled through the village's young ninja community with devastating efficiency. So much for replacing the dead last, Kiba muttered during the informal debriefing session that had spontaneously formed in Training Ground 44. Turns out the dead last was carrying the rest of us the whole time. The bitter acknowledgement of Naruto's importance was shared by most of the ninja present. They'd all grown up competing with him, measuring their progress against his development, defining their own worth partly through comparison to his achievements. Now they were discovering that those achievements had been more significant than any of them had realized, and that his absence left a gap none of them were capable of filling individually. Maybe that's the point, Shikamaru said quietly, his analytical mind working through implications that others were still struggling to process. Maybe we were never supposed to be able to replace him. Maybe the village's strategy depended on having someone irreplaceable. And now that someone's gone, Ino added with growing understanding, we're all having to figure out what we're actually worth without him to define ourselves against. The conversation was moving into territory that felt dangerous, touching on questions about village leadership and strategic planning that young ninja weren't supposed to examine too closely. What happens now? Chaoji asked. Do we keep trying to be something we're not, or do we figure out what we're actually capable of? It was exactly the question their instructors and commanders were struggling with, though they'd been approaching it from strategic rather than personal perspectives. We prove that strength comes from more than just individual power, Lee said with returning conviction. We demonstrate that teamwork and dedication can accomplish what raw force alone cannot. Pretty words, Kiba replied skeptically. But the mission reports suggest that teamwork and dedication aren't enough when you're facing opponents who don't care about your philosophical approach to problem solving. The harsh reality check silenced Lee's response, because everyone present had read the same reports and reached similar conclusions about the practical limitations of their idealistic approaches. Maybe, Shikamaru said after a long silence, the real problem isn't that we can't replace Naruto. Maybe the problem is that we let ourselves become dependent on someone being irreplaceable in the first place. The observation carried implications that none of them wanted to examine too closely, because it suggested that their village's strategic approach had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Building military strategy around irreplaceable assets was inherently unstable, creating vulnerabilities that would eventually be exploited by enemies or circumstance. Naruto's departure had simply exposed weaknesses that had always existed beneath the comfortable illusion of overwhelming individual power. "So what do we do about it?" Tenten asked. "We become stronger," Lee replied with characteristic determination. "Not stronger like Naruto, but stronger like ourselves. We develop our own capabilities instead of trying to copy his." "And if that's not enough," Kiba pressed, "if our enemies don't give us time to develop alternative approaches, if they attack while we're still figuring out what we're actually capable of?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, because they touched on fears that everyone was harboring about their village's current vulnerability and their own inadequacy to fill roles that had been defined around capabilities they didn't possess. "Then we find out what we're really made of," Neji said quietly from the edge of the group, his injuries making his presence more symbolic than physical. "We discover whether we're worth protecting, or whether we've been living off borrowed strength this whole time." As the informal gathering broke up and the various ninja returned to their individual training and assignments, each of them carried away a new understanding of both their personal limitations and their collective responsibilities. They couldn't be Naruto, but they could be themselves, if they could figure out who that was in a world that had been shaped around someone else's unprecedented capabilities. The question was whether they'd have time to develop their own approaches before circumstances forced them to confront challenges they weren't prepared to handle. That evening, in her private office, Tsunade reviewed casualty reports and mission analyses while contemplating strategic options that all seemed to lead toward uncomfortable compromises. They needed time to develop new approaches to regional security, time to train replacements for capabilities they'd lost, time to adjust their diplomatic posture to reflect changed realities about their military capabilities. But their enemies were unlikely to provide that time, especially if they understood the true extent of Konoha's current vulnerabilities, which meant that finding Naruto, or stopping him permanently, had become more than just a personal mission to save a lost student. It had become essential to the village's survival in a world where strength determined everything and the appearance of weakness invited predatory behavior. As she prepared for another sleepless night of crisis management, Tsunade found herself wondering whether they were trying to save Naruto for his sake or for their own, and whether that distinction would matter when the final confrontation came. Kakashi had been tracking Naruto for 6 weeks, and the search was destroying him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Not physically, though the constant travel, irregular sleep, and poor nutrition were taking their toll on his 30-year-old body. Not tactically, his skills as a tracker and investigator remained as sharp as ever, allowing him to follow a trail that most ninja would have lost within days. The destruction was psychological, manifesting in the slow erosion of certainties he'd built his adult life around. Each witness interview, each piece of evidence, each confirmation of his former students' activities forced him to confront the magnitude of his failure as a teacher, a mentor, and a human being. The latest report had come from a tavern keeper in a border town whose name Kakashi had already forgotten. Like so many others, the man had been eager to share his story about the Demon Fox Wanderer, embellishing details with each retelling until fact and legend became indistinguishable. "Blonde kid, maybe 16, 17, the keeper had said, wiping down glasses with the mechanical precision of someone who told this story dozens of times. Came in looking for information about some missing nin who'd been terrorizing local merchants. Polite enough, paid for his drink, didn't cause trouble. What happened?" Kakashi had asked, though he suspected he already knew the general outline. "Found the missing nin 3 days later. Or what was left of him." The keeper's expression had grown distant, haunted. "Wasn't pretty. Looked like he'd been hit by a lightning storm, then trampled by something with claws the size of kunai. And the boy, gone by then. Left payment for his room, even cleaned up after himself. But the locals," the keeper had shaken his head. "They were grateful he'd solved their problem, but scared of how easily he'd done it. Said his eyes weren't right, like he was looking through them instead of at them." Another data point in a pattern that had become disturbingly familiar. Naruto was completing objectives with ruthless efficiency, leaving behind no witnesses to his methods and no survivors among his targets. Professional work that demonstrated both advanced capabilities and complete moral flexibility about the means necessary to achieve desired ends. The kind of work that suggested someone who'd stopped seeing human life as inherently valuable and started viewing it as a resource to be managed according to practical considerations. Kakashi sat now in another anonymous inn in another forgettable town, staring at a map covered with red pins that marked confirmed sightings and incident locations. The pattern they formed told a story he didn't want to believe: steady movement toward the northeastern borders, increasingly sophisticated missions, growing reputation that would inevitably attract attention from organizations with their own uses for someone with Naruto's particular combination of power and moral flexibility. If he'd wanted to be found, Kakashi thought for the 1000th time, he'd have left a clearer trail. If he'd wanted to come home, he'd have sent some kind of message by now. The implications of that observation were too painful to examine directly, but they'd been growing stronger with each passing day. This wasn't the wandering of someone who was lost or confused about his direction. This was the methodical progress of someone who knew exactly where he was going and had no intention of being redirected by well-meaning pursuers. "Another drink?" the innkeeper asked, appearing at Kakashi's table with the kind of professional courtesy that didn't quite mask genuine concern. "You look like you could use it." Kakashi glanced down at his hands, noticing for the first time that they were shaking slightly. When had that started? When had the constant stress and sleepless nights begun manifesting in physical symptoms he couldn't control? "Information," he said instead. "I'm looking for someone. Young man, blonde hair, blue eyes, probably traveling alone. Goes by the name Naruto." The innkeeper's expression shifted immediately, friendly professionalism replaced by wary recognition. "You're the one who's been asking about the fox," he said quietly. "Third person this week. Someone's got a lot of interest in finding that particular individual." Kakashi's attention sharpened. Third person, first was a woman, maybe 40, scars on her face like she'd seen serious combat. Asked the same questions you're asking, paid well for answers, moved on the next day. The innkeeper glanced around the common room, ensuring their conversation wasn't being overheard. Second was a man with blue skin and a sword bigger than most people. Didn't ask questions so much as make statements about what he knew. Akatsuki. The description matched intelligence profiles for Hoshigaki Kisame, one of their most dangerous operatives. Which meant they weren't just monitoring Naruto's activities, they were actively tracking him, possibly for immediate recruitment. "When?" Kakashi asked, fighting to keep desperation out of his voice. 2 days ago. Maybe less, 2 days. After 6 weeks of following a trail that seemed to grow colder with each passing hour, Kakashi was suddenly within 48 hours of his target. Close enough that immediate action might prevent whatever offer Akatsuki was preparing to make. Or close enough to witness Naruto accepting that offer if the decision had already been made. Which direction? The innkeeper pointed northeast, toward the border regions where official authority was scarce and questions weren't asked about travelers with dubious backgrounds. "Be careful," he added as Kakashi prepared to leave. "The stories about the fox, they're not the kind of stories you hear about someone who's still entirely human. Whatever that boy's become, he's not someone you approach without preparation for things to go very badly." The warning proved prophetic 18 hours later, when Kakashi finally caught up with evidence of Naruto's most recent activities. The camp was professional in its layout, concealed from casual observation, positioned to provide multiple escape routes, organized to minimize the evidence of occupancy. But it wasn't empty. 2 figures sat beside a carefully banked fire, their conversation carrying clearly through the still forest air. One was unmistakably Kisame, his distinctive appearance and massive sword making identification immediate. The other was blonde, wearing clothes that had seen hard use but were well maintained, sitting with the kind of relaxed alertness that spoke of someone comfortable with potential violence. Naruto. Kakashi settled into a concealed position 50 meters away, close enough to observe and overhear without revealing his presence. What he saw and heard over the next hour would haunt him for the rest of his life. The organization values practical results over ideological purity, Kisame was explaining, his tone carrying the casual authority of someone discussing whether rather than recruitment into a criminal organization. "We don't waste time on moral complexities when simple solutions are available. Like the village councils that kept arguing about jurisdiction while their people suffered," Naruto replied, and his voice carried a hardness that Kakashi had never heard before. "Like the ninja who prioritized following orders over protecting civilians." "Exactly." We identify problems, assess the most efficient solutions, and implement them without being constrained by political considerations or sentimental attachments. Naruto nodded thoughtfully, and Kakashi felt something cold settle in his stomach at the easy way his former student was absorbing these justifications for the kind of ruthless pragmatism that defined Akatsuki's approach to problem-solving. What would my role be? Naruto asked. Initially, field operations that require someone with your particular capabilities. Intelligence gathering, target elimination, intimidation when necessary. Kasame's shark-like grin was visible even from Kakashi's distant position. Eventually, perhaps training and recruitment of other assets who share your realistic understanding of how the world actually works. And the ultimate goal? Peace, Kasame replied with apparent sincerity. Not the false peace of political treaties that shift with changing leadership, but genuine peace born from universal understanding of the consequences of conflict. Through suffering, through education. Suffering is simply the most effective teacher for lessons that people refuse to learn through gentler methods. Kakashi watched his former student consider this philosophy with the kind of serious attention he'd once reserved for tactical instruction. There was no immediate rejection, no moral outrage at the implications of what was being suggested. Just thoughtful evaluation of a proposal that aligned with conclusions Naruto had apparently reached through his own experiences. I need time to consider, Naruto said finally. Of course, take whatever time you need. Kasame stood, shouldering his massive weapon with casual ease. When you're ready to discuss specifics, you know how to contact us. We'll be waiting. After the Akatsuki member departed, Naruto remained by the dying fire, staring into the flames with an expression that mixed contemplation with something that might have been anticipation. This was Kakashi's opportunity, Naruto alone, apparently receptive to conversation, isolated from immediate support or interference. Everything he'd been searching for during weeks of desperate pursuit. But as he prepared to reveal himself and attempt the reconciliation he'd been planning throughout his journey, Kakashi found himself paralyzed by the realization that he no longer knew what to say to the person sitting across the clearing. This wasn't the boy who'd left Konoha months ago. This wasn't the enthusiastic student who'd once annoyed him with constant demands for attention and training. This was someone else entirely, harder, more focused, operating according to principles that had been shaped by experiences Kakashi hadn't shared and couldn't fully understand. Someone who might genuinely prefer Akatsuki's offer to anything Konoha could provide. I know you're there, Naruto said quietly, not turning from his contemplation of the fire. You can come out, Kakashi-sensei. I'm not going to run. The casual acknowledgement of his presence was almost more disturbing than everything else Kakashi had witnessed. No surprise, no alarm, no indication that being tracked and observed was unexpected or unwelcome. As if Naruto had known he was being followed and simply hadn't cared enough to lose his pursuer. Kakashi emerged from concealment slowly, his hands visible and his posture non-threatening. This wasn't the time for the kind of tactical maneuvering that had defined their previous teacher-student interactions. Naruto, he said, and was dismayed to hear how uncertain his own voice sounded. Kakashi-sensei, Naruto replied with polite acknowledgement that carried no warmth. You've been tracking me for a while now. I was wondering when you'd finally decide to make contact. You knew I was following you for about 3 weeks. You're good, but enhanced senses make hiding much more difficult than most people realize. Naruto finally turned to look at him directly, and Kakashi felt his heart stop at what he saw in those blue eyes. They were still recognizably Naruto's eyes, but they held a depth and hardness that belonged to someone who'd seen and done things that couldn't be undone. The innocent optimism that had once defined his student's worldview had been replaced by something that evaluated everything and everyone according to practical utility rather than emotional connection. Why didn't you lose me if you knew I was there? Because I was curious about what you'd do when you finally caught up. Whether you'd try to drag me back by force, attempt to convince me through emotional manipulation, or actually listen to what I'd become and why. The clinical assessment of his likely approaches was accurate in ways that made Kakashi uncomfortable. Naruto had clearly spent considerable time thinking about this eventual confrontation, planning for multiple contingencies, while Kakashi had been operating on desperate hope and increasingly frantic improvisation. I came to bring you home, Kakashi said, though the words felt inadequate even as he spoke them. I know. The question is whether you understand that I already am home. Naruto gestured around them at the forest clearing, the dying fire, the evidence of a life lived entirely according to his own choices. This is what home looks like when you're free to choose it for yourself. This isn't home, Naruto. This is exile. This is running away from everything you swore to protect. This is evolution, Naruto corrected gently. This is what happens when you stop trying to be what other people need you to be and start discovering what you're actually capable of becoming. The calm certainty in his voice was more disturbing than any anger or resentment would have been. This wasn't someone who'd been driven to desperate measures by pain or isolation. This was someone who'd made calculated decisions based on careful evaluation of available options. The village needs you, Kakashi said, falling back on arguments that had seemed more compelling before he'd had to voice them directly. The village needs the Nine Tails, Naruto replied with the same dispassionate precision. They've made that distinction clear enough times that I finally started listening. That's not true. You're more than just what? More than just a weapon they can deploy when convenient and ignore when not. More than just a symbol they can manipulate to maintain morale while denying me the basic acceptance they give to every other ninja who serves their interests. Each question was a blade twisted in wounds that had never properly healed. Because the horrible truth was that Naruto was right, the village had never seen him as more than the sum of his utility to their strategic objectives. I failed you, Kakashi said quietly, the admission torn from him by the weight of evidence he could no longer deny. As your teacher, as your mentor, as someone who should have seen what was happening and intervened before it was too late. Yes, Naruto agreed without anger or accusation, just matter-of-fact acknowledgement of something they both knew to be true. You did fail me, but so did everyone else who was supposed to care about my well-being rather than my combat effectiveness. Let me make it right. Let me help you come home and what? Pretend that nothing has changed. Go back to being their loyal weapon while they continue to treat me as a useful monster rather than a person. Naruto shook his head. I've moved beyond the need for their approval, Kakashi-sensei. I've discovered what it means to be valued for what I am rather than tolerated for what I represent. By Akatsuki, they're using you just as much as they're offering me partnership. Genuine partnership between equals who share common goals and compatible methods. Not the false partnership of village service, where I provide the power and others make the decisions about how it's used. The distinction was crucial, and one that Kakashi couldn't argue against because it was accurate. Konoha had never offered Naruto true partnership. They'd offered conditional acceptance in exchange for absolute loyalty, service without agency, belonging without respect. Akatsuki, for all their moral failures, were at least honest about what they wanted and what they offered in return. Their methods involve mass murder and psychological torture, Kakashi said desperately. They want to reshape the world through forced suffering and elimination of anyone who opposes them. And our methods involve maintaining the status quo through selective violence and preservation of systems that create the suffering they're trying to end. Naruto's response was immediate and devastating in its logic. At least their approach addresses root causes rather than managing symptoms. Kakashi opened his mouth to argue, to defend the village's approach to peace and security, but the words died in his throat. Because when he examined Konoha's actions honestly, the wars they'd fought, the enemies they'd eliminated, the political compromises they'd made, he couldn't identify fundamental moral differences between their methods and Akatsuki's. The only real difference was scale and honesty about ultimate objectives. You're not thinking clearly, he said finally, falling back on the explanation that had become reflexive whenever Naruto expressed ideas that challenged comfortable assumptions. The Nine Tails is influencing your judgment. Stop. The word came out sharp enough to cut, carrying authority that made Kakashi's objection die instantly. Stop blaming the fox for thoughts and conclusions I've reached through my own experiences. Stop dismissing every criticism of the village as demonic corruption rather than legitimate assessment of their failures. Naruto, the Nine Tails didn't make me leave Konoha. Your failures did. The Nine Tails didn't drive me to accept contracts that prioritize results over sentiment. The village's hypocrisy did. And the Nine Tails didn't make Akatsuki's offer appealing. Your inability to provide meaningful alternatives did. Each accusation hit with surgical precision, targeting the guilt and self-doubt that had been growing in Kakashi's mind throughout his weeks of pursuit. I can change, Kakashi said desperately. The village can change. Give us another chance to. I've given you 15 years of chances, Naruto interrupted. 15 years of hoping that dedication and service would eventually earn the acceptance you kept promising was just around the corner. I'm done giving chances to people who have proven they don't value what I offer. The finality in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't negotiation or emotional manipulation. It was simple statement of a decision that had already been made and wouldn't be reconsidered based on last-minute appeals. "So what happens now?" Kakashi asked. "Now you go back to Konoha and report that you found me healthy, capable, and committed to a path that doesn't include service to people who never appreciated what they had." Naruto stood, beginning to pack his minimal gear with efficient movements. "And I continue my journey toward purposes worthy of what I've become. I can't just let you walk away." "You can't stop me from walking away," Naruto corrected gently. "But you're welcome to try, if you think violence will succeed where conversation has failed." The offer was made without hostility, just practical acknowledgement that their conflict had reached a point where words were no longer adequate to resolve fundamental differences. Kakashi studied his former student, assessing capabilities that had clearly advanced far beyond anything he'd witnessed during their time together. The relaxed confidence, the subtle signs of enhanced physical abilities, the complete absence of doubt about his capacity to handle whatever challenges might arise, all indicators that a direct confrontation would end very badly for the person stupid enough to initiate it. "I won't fight you," he said finally. "Good, that shows wisdom I wasn't entirely certain you possessed." Naruto shouldered his pack and prepared to leave. "Give my regards to anyone who actually cared about my well-being rather than my utility. It should be a short list." Naruto, wait, but he was already gone, vanishing into the forest with the kind of enhanced speed that made pursuit futile even if Kakashi had been inclined to attempt it. Alone in the clearing with a dying fire and the weight of absolute failure crushing down on his shoulders, Kakashi finally understood what he'd been refusing to acknowledge throughout his desperate search. The student he'd been trying to save no longer existed. The boy who'd once dreamed of becoming Hokage had been replaced by someone who'd learned to find meaning and purpose outside the systems that had failed him. Someone who might genuinely be better off with Akatsuki than with the village that had shaped his transformation through their casual cruelty and institutional neglect. As dawn broke over the forest and Kakashi began the long journey back to report his failure, he carried with him the certainty that he'd just witnessed the death of the last innocent idealism in his former student's heart, and the birth of something that would reshape the ninja world in ways no prophecy had ever predicted. Thanks for listening. I do hope you enjoyed it. If you want the next part of this video, like, subscribe and comment down below and turn on the bell notification. And also check out other videos that I have created and enjoy. Stay tuned for more exciting what-if stories and other amazing videos coming your way. Until next time, take care, stay curious.